I invite you to go ahead and turn in your Bible to Mark chapter 1, 29 through 34. We'll read that in just a moment. That'll be the basis for our lesson. The stories of Jesus, they are so wonderful. And really, the stories are so appealing to us that they make you want to believe. I don't know how anyone could read these stories about Jesus and say, well, I don't want to believe that. No, it's something you really want to believe by reading it, but we don't believe just because we want to. There's reasons to believe. And the reason Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing to us and giving us these stories, one, it creates a desire in us to want to believe, but second, it gives us a reason to believe. The text we're going to look at is Mark 1, 29 through 34. That's not the only place this story is told. It's also told in the two texts under that, the one in Matthew and the one in Luke. We've got this story told 3 times. And you know, the Bible lays out the principle, at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. We don't just have what Mark's saying. Well, Matthew's there. He's saying it too. Luke said, I went and checked it out. And I'm going to tell you the story. Let me tell you what I found out. And so we've got 3 witnesses. Now let me tell you, you look at these stories that the 3 told, and they didn't all tell the story the same way. Let me give you an example of that. Peter's mother lays sick of a fever, and Matthew says that Jesus touched her. You know what Mark says? He took her by the hand and lifted her up. Well, then he touched her, didn't he? You can't take somebody by the hand without touching them. But they didn't say it the exact same way, did they? Did you know Luke doesn't say he touched her? But Luke says something that neither Matthew nor Mark says. Luke says Jesus stood over her and rebuked the fever. Well, what happened? Well, that's pretty easy, isn't it? Now, the whole picture starts coming into view. Jesus goes over there. He looks over her and rebukes the fever and takes her by the hand, touches her hand, and lifts her up. Well, the stories all fit together. That's what it is. They're not told identically, but they all fit together. Now, if they were copying from each other, if Matthew, I'm going to copy what Mark said, and Luke's going to, well, they would tell it all just the same, wouldn't they? But they tell it differently. That doesn't sound like they were copying each other. And yet the stories, when you read these 3 accounts, they sound so similar in the way they are told. How do you explain that? What's going on here? Let me tell you, before these stories were written down, they were spoken. The ones that were there, we know it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They were there. After this happened, they started telling the story. And others that would hear them tell the story, they'd tell the story. And so there is the spoken word that existed before the written word. And so that we might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The Holy Spirit worked through Matthew and Mark and Luke. It says, write down what you hear. You know, when you tell a story, there's ways to tell a story. And a lot of people tell stories a little different, but the basic way of telling that story stays the same. And yet everybody kind of tells the story a little differently. And that's what we have here. That story that was spoken is now written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 3 men writing down that story that must have been commonly told and preserved for us. It's like Those writers, they're saying, this is why I believe Jesus is the Christ. And now you can believe, because you have the same stories I've heard. You've got it written down where you can read it. And you pull these stories together. That's the beauty of having these stories told in the manner in which they are, and that shows up in this. Let's read what Mark says about it. Mark 1, 29 through, I think it's 34, because we're going to read what follows this. And forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever. And anon they tell him of her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And immediately the fever left her. And she ministered unto them. And at even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils, and all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. Now, put this in context. Jesus, after his baptism, had gone by the Sea of Galilee, and they knew of Jesus. We know from what John had said, they knew of Jesus from John the Baptist and his preaching, and they'd already been convinced that this is the one of whom Moses and the prophets did write. But now Jesus is back in Galilee. They've gone back and they're out fishing and they're mending their nets, and Jesus comes by the Sea of Galilee. And he calls Peter and Andrew and James and John to be his, it was the first four he called to be his close disciples. Disciples, all the followers, but these close followers that are going to be apostles someday. And they follow Jesus. And so on the Sabbath day, they follow him into the synagogue in Capernaum. And I've got the gist of it written down there. I don't have every word, but do you remember what happened? Jesus is teaching them, and they're marveled that Jesus spoke as one having authority, and a man with an evil spirit, possessed, how does it say? Matthew described it, a man with an unclean spirit cries out, I know who thou art, the Holy One of God. Imagine how shocking that would have been. Someone would have jumped up and start yelling something out here while I'm up here preaching. Well, that would kind of be shocking to us. And Jesus rebuked that demon, and he tore that man. And the demon departed from him. And the man was okay. And people marveled. Well, what kind of man is this? He not only speaks with authority, but even the demons and the unclean spirits, they obey his voice. And so they went out, and it says his fame spread throughout all the region of Galilee. It's kind of like us. We leave church that day that happened. We tell folks about it. And they left that Sabbath, that synagogue on that Sabbath day, and they went out telling people what had occurred this morning while we were gathered together for worship when Jesus was there. I want you to notice that's what leads up to this. Before we go on to the next, though, look at this. Look at that word, straightway. See that word? Look down there, the word immediately. I'm going to tell you something about the book of Mark here. Here's what follows next. And forthwith, straightway, immediately, forthwith. It's the same word here, translated anon. It's the only place it's translated there, and anon's not a word we usually use. Probably if you have a different translation, it has something like immediately, or as soon as Jesus walked in, or suddenly, something like that. Anon. And then it says, immediately the fever left her. 5 times. 5 times. That's 5 times, that's about 5 out of 10, and depending on how you count, 5 out of 11 times in Mark chapter 1, where you read that. Let me just get the sense of what Mark is doing here. The word is really here, where it says make his path straight, but that might be a little different use of the word. But down in Mark chapter 1 and verse 10, straightway coming up out of the water. In verse 12, and immediately the Spirit driveth him into the wilderness. It's in verse 18, and straightway they forsook their nets and followed him. Verse 20, and straightway he called to them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship, In verse 21, and they went to Capernaum and straightway entered the synagogue. And immediately his fame was spread abroad. And immediately they came out of the synagogue and went to the house. And on they told him about her. Immediately the fever left her. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him. Down in verse 43, and he straightly charged them, and forthwith sent him away. That's about 10 or 11 times. That's in the first chapter. You go through the 16 chapters of the book of Mark, you're going to find that word, or a word like it, 45 times. That kind of depends on how you count, okay? Because it's not just quite that clear cut, but about 45 times. It's as though Mark can't hardly get this story out. That there's a sense when you get to reading Mark, if you ever get to reading Mark and feel like, well, I got to kind of rush. You've read things, I got to rush through. I got to keep reading and read what, and you get a little anxious or urgent about what you're reading. This is why Mark put these words all the way through the book of Mark. Keep you going. Keep going. I've got a point to make. He does it all the way until he gets to the end, and that triumphant resurrection at the end. It's been said the book of Mark is a book about the crucifixion of Christ with a long introduction, and that might be a good way to look at it. But it's just part of the characteristic of Mark for this urgency to keep showing up through his work. I'll point that out as we go on through there. But now they came out of the synagogue and entered into the house. Okay? They came out of the synagogue and entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now they've gone and they think they know where Capernaum is. They know about where it is, but now the archaeologists have dug and they think they've got it. This matches. This matches what they see. You see the arrow pointing down? That is where they said that's the synagogue. Now, the synagogue Jesus spoke in was destroyed when the Romans came through around AD 70. It's not that same building, but right after that it was rebuilt by a Roman centurion, the historians tell us. And it was rebuilt probably very much like it was at the beginning. And these are the remnants of that old synagogue that was rebuilt. They say you can go and stand in that synagogue and you'll be almost where Jesus was, standing almost where he was when he was preaching. You see the arrow pointing up in the strange arrangement of the stones there? It's an old church. And they've excavated that church. And it's on top of a house. There's a foundation of a house under that church. And the tradition is that's Peter's house. That's why that church was built there. And they've actually uncovered some other evidence where they're not 100% sure, but they're pretty sure. They found the synagogue and they found the house. You know, seeing those things makes the story real, doesn't it? To know that you can go back and if that's not exactly it, you can find things that are just like what Mark is telling us about. Jesus leaving the synagogue and then walking over into the house of Simon and Andrew. They were brothers. It's an extended family living in this house, and Simon's mother-in-law is there with them in that house. So, there they go. Now she lay sick of a fever. There's such a change that's taken place here. Jesus up preaching in public in the synagogue, and the dramatic event of the man shouting out and the demon tearing him and leaving him and the people going forth, a very public, dramatic, disturbing event. And now he leaves there and goes into a very simple domestic situation. It's a private event. Now, I don't know if Peter knew the man that was possessed with the demon or not, but he knew his mother-in-law. This gets very personal. The miracles Jesus performed are of such a variety. Total strangers. You could watch them and see them be healed of their infirmities. But then someone that you know, someone very close, like a mother-in-law, you don't have this one wrong. You weren't fooled. She doesn't act like this. She is really sick. She's got a fever. And then to see that miracle, well, that would be something that you couldn't have been fooled on, could it? And so the variety of those miracles Jesus performed, it's not any one story, but you start putting all these stories together, it makes the case, how can someone not believe that Jesus is the Christ? Now, she lay sick of a fever, and you know, fever is really good for you. We don't think so. We get fever when we're sick, and it's the body's way of fighting off infection and disease, because a lot of the things that make us sick can't survive at an elevated temperature. So the body goes up in temperature, and it's part of the defense system. But a fever can get out of hand, and the fever itself can become dangerous. Well, they didn't understand all about diseases at all. They knew when you're in fever, you're in trouble. You've got a fever. And no doubt, like many of us, all the discomforts that come with a fever, pile upon that all the fears. And they didn't have treatments for fevers like we do. They didn't say, well, we'll take an aspirin or something. They didn't have things to know how to keep a fever down. And then the fear of death. They've got a fever. I wonder if they're going to die. Because people did. Luke tells us in his story, Luke the physician, it's a great fever. She had a serious fever. She didn't just have a little temperature. And it can take your life. The story told in John, though he's not this story, told about a man coming to Jesus saying that his son is at the point of death. And that's where Jesus spoke the word, and the servant went back and found his son. And when he found out the time, it was the time, that's when the fever left him. See, the fever was either a sign or a cause that that son was at the point of death. And now he walks into Simon's house, and my mother-in-law wasn't at worship this morning. And walk in, she's laying there sick of a fever. So, he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And immediately the fever left. And she ministered unto them. Immediately. It wasn't that the fever broke. Now she's going to start feeling better, you know. Well, we can tell when our little child's fever breaks, doesn't it? They start sweating, or the chills. But anyway, now the fever's broke. And a lot of times after you've been through that, what do you want to do? Let them rest and recover their strength. But not this. This is not a normal passing of a fever. She immediately stood up, started ministering unto them. And you know, that is just that fits so well. Isn't that what you ladies want to do when someone's in your house? Don't you feel responsible for them? You want to be the one taking care of the guests, don't you? I mean, those old Peter and Simon, they might not even wash the dishes. They might give them dirty dishes. I've got to get up and take care of this. And so the woman of the home is the one that usually becomes the one that extends that hospitality. And so that's what she does. She gets up and says, I'm not going to let these men just be she's going to take care of that. I won't see an Aunt B type character here, you know, looking after the folks that come into the home. And so that's exactly what we would expect, wouldn't we? What a miracle that took place. It would have meant a lot to Peter. It would have meant a lot to Andrew to have this in their memories. Now at evening, when the sun did set, see, it was the Sabbath. The Sabbath is over when the sun sets. There were all kinds of traditions imposed upon people. The Lord made the Sabbath day a day of rest. And the way the Pharisees had treated the Sabbath, it had almost become a burden to rest it on the Sabbath day of all the things you couldn't do. When the sun sets, you're free of all those traditions. The sun set. The Sabbath is over. And in that twilight, here they come. Remember how the fame went forth out of that synagogue going into all Galilee? Well, it got all over Capernaum. So as soon as that sun goes down, we're going to go see him. And now the sun went down and they come to the door. And look what they're doing. They're bringing all that were diseased and possessed with devils. And there's a lot we don't understand about this, possessed with devils. I'm sure there's a lot they didn't understand. But it was different than a disease. Now, sometime they may have had the symptoms of a disease because of that possession, but the people understood the difference in the disease and the possession, didn't they? And so some were diseased that didn't have devils. Some had devils that didn't have disease. Now, some may have had both, but they were able to distinguish the difference. And so they were diseased and possessed of devil. All the city gathered together at the door. Well, it must have been a crowded little area. You saw how close the synagogue was and the house. It didn't look like they had big, wide streets. Must have been a congested area. Gathered there at the door of the house there where they were staying. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, various problems that people had. He's a physician that never lost a case. No matter what problem you brought him, he knew how to heal that. Healed them of divers diseases, cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. Remember how James said, the devils believe and tremble. They knew, and when that devil cried out in the synagogue, we know who thou art, the Holy One of God. Jesus rebuked him and had him hold his peace. Jesus is going to reveal himself to man on his own terms, and he didn't need the devil's help. And so he told them, you be quiet. And Jesus took control of the situation. Luke tells us this. The devils were crying out in Luke 4:41. They were saying, thou art the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says, you be quiet. He'd reveal that at his pace, at his time, to his purpose. And Matthew adds this, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he took our infirmities and bare our sickness. Now that's quoting from the Greek translation of the old Hebrew Old Testament. But the translation we have from the Hebrew comes from Isaiah 53 in verse 4. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And these infirmities and sickness gives us griefs and sorrows, doesn't it? And so Jesus came doing that, symbolic of what he's going to do for us spiritually. What he did physically anticipates and symbolizes and shows what he's going to do for us spiritually. And so the miracle is there, and then there's the fulfilled prophecy as well. How could this not be the Christ? And then John, he doesn't tell this story, but John tells us this. Many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life in his name. I want you to remember that now. When you read from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are 4 New Testament books written to unbelievers so that they could believe. And then we benefit from them too, don't we? Strengthens our faith. It makes us joyful to know that God came in such a form as this and gives us insight then into who God is and who the heart of God is. So it motivates us to want to believe and provides reasons for us to believe. Now, I want to catch this. This is mostly in the bulletin, and I'm not going to go over what's in the bulletin fully. But this idea about Peter being the first pope, you see, Peter had a wife, and that creates problems with this doctrine about Peter being the pope. See, it's Simon's wife's mother. Well, you know, that's how you get mother-in-laws. You don't get a mother-in-law unless you get married and you have a wife. Well, you know, a wife can marry a husband, but You got to be married if you want to have a mother-in-law. And even if you don't want a mother-in-law, if you get married, you're liable to get one. Okay? So that's how mother-in-laws come. That means Peter is married. It specifically talks about his wife. It's Peter's wife's mother. We read this again in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5. Paul says, have we not power? By power, that's the right, the authority, permission. Paul wasn't married, but he could have been. There wasn't anything forbidding him being married. Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife? What does he mean, a sister? Well, he says, as well as the other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas. What he's talking about sisters in the sense he's talking about brethren. Peter had a wife. She was a sister. That tells us that Peter's wife at some time was baptized for the remission of her sins, like Peter had been. And so here he is, Cephas. That's Peter. Simon, Peter, and Cephas, it's all the same person. Well, Peter had a wife. She was a member of the church. And then Peter tells us he had a wife. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 1, the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder. He didn't say he was the elder. See, the Pope goes back to the way we got a Pope is, he's just an elder. There's assumed too much authority is what he is. The Pope. He didn't say, the elders which are among you, who is the Pope? Now, he didn't claim to be the Pope. He was an elder with other elders. But in order to be an elder, 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:6, you're the husband of one wife. Peter had a wife. And yet, today, in the Roman Catholic Church, in order to be a Pope, you're supposed to have taken a vow of celibacy. They say, well, that wasn't the rule back then. Then you could be Pope without taking a vow of celibacy. Well, don't you see the problem with that? Who changed the rules? And so they still got the problem. And down through ages, men have taken what the Bible says. It tells us, I don't have it here, but in Timothy, it talks about time would come when people would forbid to marry. Well, we don't have the right to change God's rules. Our faith, it is a fundamental doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. But that's not a New Testament doctrine. And you do not have to believe that the Pope is the vicar of Christ to be saved. What you need to believe is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that's why these stories are given to us. That's why we have these accounts, that we might believe. Do you believe? Don't you want to believe? Don't you want to believe that God is the kind of God that would care for us in the way that Jesus did and have that kind of power combined with that kind of a compassion that He can save us? Well, that's a joyful thing to believe. And we can believe it. The evidence is there. It is documented as well as anything that would ever come out of that period of history. If you can believe anything that happened back then, you ought to be able to believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So with that, I extend the invitation to become a Christian, a brother in Christ, and a sister in Christ. Once for my poor sin-sick soul, Christ did every burden roll. Now I'll walk redeemed and whole, hand in hand with Jesus. That's where you want to be. And so with that, I extend the invitation for you to come forward as we stand and sing.